suffering a direct hit from Hurricane Irma, which in the couple days leading up to impact in the state of Florida the trajectory was that it could possibly have a direct hit toward what would have been South Broward, Hollywood, Fort Lauderdale, North Miami, etc. So clearly, from a governmental standpoint and as the mayor of a city, our main responsibility before the storm was getting the city and our residents to be as responsible as can be to secure their own property and make accommodations for themselves to be safe during the storm. And of course, you all know, living here in South Florida, how we're accustomed to boarding up our homes and getting our own alternative forms of power, or perhaps by generator, ready and set to go, making accommodations to evacuate if we want to, if we choose to, but being ready. And so in Hollywood, we had, of course, you talked a little bit before about evacuations. We have evacuation zones that, per the county, needed to be evacuated. A mandatory evacuation order means that no one's going to really come and force you out of your house, but it's mandatory in the sense of the government's telling you you should be going. But again, it's not forcible evacuation. So I can say before the storm, I'm proud to say, like I think in most of South Florida, we had many residents and businesses really be responsible and take every precaution they knew to take, whether they evacuated or stayed put, sheltered in place, secured their homes and their property, and got ready for the storm. And then the storm, of course, hit. And of course, we all know what the impacts were here in South Florida, mainly wind damage and storm surge, at least for us on Hollywood. And if I start really at the beach and kind of go inland a little bit, like other coastal cities, let's start with the beach itself, the sandy beach, of course, with the winds blowing. And a lot of this storm lasted for, I think, about 9 hours of tropical storm to Category 1 type winds. We've had a lot of our beach sand blow west and end up in our case in Hollywood, we have a beautiful brick pavered broad walk along the central part of our beach. It's rated as a top 10 beach in the country, and that broad walk, that attraction, that really that draw that brings a lot of tourism and runs our beach economy was covered in almost a foot of sand. So we had a lot of recovery to lead as a city government from the eastern edge of our coast, from the sand and the broadwalk, and then all the way going west. We have a barrier island in Hollywood, and so we had a lot of the wind and the sand overrun and the flooding impacts on the barrier island with salt water. And then we immediately, of course, have the Intracoastal Waterway, and then west of that, we have a low-lying neighborhood called the Hollywood Lakes neighborhood, which Dr. Polsky and FAU know real well, is a low-lying neighborhood similar to Las Olas here in Fort Lauderdale and neighborhoods in Miami Beach that are very prone to sea level rise impacts. So here we had a storm surge, we had an east-blowing wind, and if I did have a presentation here, I would show you resident-taken home video that shows the wind blowing and the water just totally overrunning the shoreline that we have, the fortified shoreline, the seawalls, for example. So I think it makes you, of course, understand that no matter what you do sometimes as a city, you can build defenses to try to defend a city and property for a 50-year or 100-year occurrence, but sometimes you can't, and nature will overpower anything man might be able to build sometimes. So then, of course, what do? Of course, you have to be resilient toward being able to bounce back from when something that may happen and could happen does happen. And so, of course, cleaning up the city, making sure that you have infrastructure that can allow salt water to drain quickly. These are all things that I think every municipal government finds its own, of course, obligation to take care of. And I think one reflection that I have as the new mayor of a city that got hit by a hurricane was to, of course, quickly see how dependent cities are on either private contractors or outside government agencies to do their part in helping your own city bounce back from a disaster, whether it's FP&L and the power company that is the one that's going to come and turn everybody's power on. People might, call the city government and say, when's my power coming on? But of course, we have a dependency on FP&L, and so we don't always, as city government, control everything, every aspect of being able to bounce back from a natural disaster. So whether it's that, of course, we had a lot of wind damage that affected mostly the tree canopy of the city. Hollywood, for the past 37 years, has been a tree city USA, meaning we have a beautiful, lush tree canopy. But that, of course, suffers a lot of impact when there's 9 hours of tropical force storm winds. So we had a lot of trees, about almost 500,000 cubic tons of debris on the roadways and on private property that we had to collect. And then, of course, a lot of you that might have been here in South Florida living here will know that it took a lot longer than usual to start seeing the debris contractors appear and start doing work in our different municipalities. So, this storm, Irma, of course, was of a magnitude that impacted the entire state. Almost every county had tons of debris all over it, and so there wasn't enough. There wasn't the cavalry like FP&L has coordinated with its fellow investor-owned power companies to bring in a force of 23,000 utility restoration contractors to help get the power back up. There isn't that type of magnitude of organizational force that does this in the debris cleanup part of it. And so there was a lot of impact, of course, to getting the power restored and getting the debris cleaned up. We're still in the midst of getting debris finished up and cleaned up here in the city of Hollywood and really all of South Florida. Most of it's gone, but there's still more to do. And of course, we've left some of our own municipal facilities to last because we wanted to get to the residents first. So still more work to do. There's a lot of cleanup from these storms. So, as the mayor, I can tell you that there's certainly a lot of lessons that you learn, I think, for all of us, of what the state can do better. The state meaning all of us within the state, not just the state government, to better coordinate and protect ourselves from mishaps that can happen and delay the resiliency of our own, our own environment here in our own cities. Everything from, if we take it back to the eastern part of the city, we talked about the beaches, the dunes, for example. Next week, we're looking at our a master plan for building even more dunes through seagrasses and what have you, and sea oats on the beach to fortify the beach. We're looking at, of course, studying better protections for our low-lying neighborhoods. We have already in the city of Hollywood constructed more secure or better storm system infrastructure to prevent water from sea level rise going up and through the stormwater system and onto the streets, through valve installations. We work with FDOT to try to improve the roadways that FDOT can help us with, the state roads that run through the city. There's much to do, but also we found ourselves as a city that's outsourced, for example, waste collection for purposes of reducing the cost of doing business in Hollywood. We also found ourselves, I found the city to be lacking a sufficient level of our own equipment to be out there in our own city with our own municipal employees being able to do some of this immediate work where there was a delay in getting private contractors. So we're looking at perhaps ramping back up at least the minimum level of bucket trucks and tree chipper trucks and crews to be able to better control and take care of what we need to do, what our responsibility is, at least on an emergency basis for the city. We can't be without holding at least a minimal number of equipment pieces to be able to service the community. So there's a lot the city government can do, a lot of what we need to do to coordinate, of course, with the county, the state. I can tell you that in the run-up to the storm here with Irma, there was a great level of communication between the state government, facilitating nightly conference calls with the governor and all the emergency department heads on the phone, open mic. Every city that wanted to be on the call could be on the call, ask any questions, and there was a lot of back and forth. So I think, though, when the storm did hit and was so widespread, I think there was a little bit of a slowdown in being able to address everybody as quickly as everybody wanted. You guys had heard about what was said about the nursing and the ALF industry, being very vulnerable to lack of power and the inability to keep people alive during power. Of course, the deaths happened in the city of Hollywood. Our hearts were broken for the people who lost their lives, but we recognize that this is a big issue for the entire state, and hopefully we'll see the industry and the state government put up sensible rules that will better protect and better protect the seniors that are there in a nursing home type predicament. So there's a lot to do. I don't want to keep talking. I want to hear from Professor Kim and my fellow panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. We actually have built a lot of time into this panel so we can, at the end of this, have a really good conversation. But I saw a quick question go up here.
Yeah, you mentioned evacuation. That's something that I do a lot of work in. How do you, as a city of Hollywood, look at evacuation in terms of, do you look at it as like a life or death issue, or do you encourage people to move out? And are you, or is it the state or whomever, because we had an earlier question about the coordination at the state level. Are you looking for people to move just 4 miles inland to a shelter, or do you want them to get out of the city, out of the county, out of the state?
Well, of course, it depends on what storm you're facing.
Okay, let's say Irma, for example. This one specifically.
So we have, just like every other city, we have particular areas. In our case, the eastern part of our city that's coastal are deemed to be mandatory evacuation zones. Zones A and B, for example, Barrier Island, and then those neighborhoods east of US 1, the county determines and designates when an evacuation zone is activated. So we, as the city, basically are relaying the communication and the order from the county and helping to facilitate that. Where people evacuate to, whether it's one of the county designated shelters, usually at one of the public schools, and so one of the questions was, where do you evacuate through reciprocity agreements, nursing homes? Well, my understanding is that only nursing homes that were in the evacuation zones needed to quote-unquote evacuate. The one, for example, in Hollywood where 12 people or 14 people lost their lives was not in an evacuation zone, so they didn't need to go anywhere from a storm threat standpoint. They're not in an evacuation zone. But clearly we see through Irma how dependent we all are on power to live our life as we know it, and on communication systems too. We had a circumstance where police couldn't communicate in Broward County because cell phone service was down. At the most critical, the storm is hitting us type of moment, police couldn't communicate. And so suddenly we're looking, I think as a region, to say, wait a second, we gave up a robust radio system because cell phones are a lot better and available, where now do we need to downgrade and go a little more analog to make sure communication is there because of our dependency now on cell towers and signals.
But do you look at it, I mean, that's a personal choice. Like, at what level is it the city's responsibility to move people who either can't or won't? Or do you just say, well, look, this is a personal choice. You have to make the decision whether to go or not. When do we tell you or not?
Right, so I think hotels can tell you nicely to leave because they're responsible for you and it's a mandatory evacuation, so they have to look out for those that are within their, let's just call it duty of care. But people that own property, within the law as it is today, no one can take you by the arm and handcuff you and say you have to leave now and I'm going to forcibly evacuate you if you're not going to do so yourself. It's a personal responsibility to do so. But it was discussed about people who might need help, people that are vulnerable who might not be able to help. So for example, in Hollywood we have a citizens emergency response team, a group of volunteer residents who have a list of vulnerable residents, and before the storm call them and try to evacuate them and try to help them on a human, on a personal level if they can't help themselves, those that we know of. Yep.
The Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration recommends in your emergency plan for nursing homes 50 miles to the north, south, east, or west, but with this storm it was 210 miles across, so it really didn't do much. But my question for the mayor, and since you're a first-timer mayor, you talked a lot about the post-storm. Leading up to it, can you kind of walk us through what that couple hours was like for you? Because it really was 5 days of preparation. I know it was only 9 hours in the storm, but that whole week leading up to it, we were told, the cone is this wide, it's that wide. At one point, I know Hollywood was set for landfall. I think that was Saturday night they were called for.
Yeah, it was.
Landfall. What was it like for you, and where were you getting your juice from? Was it from Broward County? Was it from the governor's office? Was it from your emergency management office? What was it like for you?
It was all three. It was being on the state conference calls with the governor's office, being on the county conference calls at noontime with the county emergency directors that had a lot more of a local picture. And then, of course, through our own activation of our own Center for Emergency Management, our own nerve hub, having every municipal department head there, not for the whole 5 days, but right before the storm. Everybody out there ready to do their part, whether it was police, fire, rescue, public works, utilities. Every department was there and at the ready. But like any other homeowner, the city government finds itself responsible for a certain geographic area, whether it's your own home or, in our case, a city, making sure that everybody's safe and having the plans to keep everybody safe, knowing that there's going to be a power outage too. So a lot to do, but there's 1,500 people who work for the city of Hollywood, and I think there was emergency response preparedness plans, and it was executed really well. I think we were ready for the storm. Can't say that you're ready for a direct hit from a hurricane that was a Category 5 hurricane a couple of days before it made landfall. No one could really be prepared for that, but we did everything, like every other city, I think, in South Florida, did everything we could to be ready.
Mayor, and before we move on to Professor Kim, what would you do, or what do you recognize through the Irma experience as maybe your largest weaknesses, and what do you think you want to do between now and next hurricane season to be better prepared?
So a comment was made about power, for example, and how we can prevent such widespread power loss if we can, and a comment was made about tree trimming. I think we understand that being a Tree City USA, you also have sometimes the wrong tree in the wrong place under power lines. So I think working with developing a program where we can better trim trees to put the power grid less at risk from tree branches hitting the lines and causing a transformer to blow. But one thing that I sort of noticed, and I think impacts the entire state, is that it was mentioned before how power poles are being replaced from wood to concrete to make them more wind resistant, what have you, and that FP&L has invested a ton of money in doing that, rightfully so. But a big weakness in the power grid is that some of FP&L infrastructure is situated on power poles by communications companies like AT&T and what have you, and those companies don't have the same requirements or don't elect to invest the monies to harden their communication pole system, so that when you have power lines, power infrastructure connected along the grid through AT&T's poles, and they didn't bother to replace them with concrete poles, next thing you know, you have really really weak links in the big system. So I think the state of Florida, and we're writing our legislators about this, needs to look at the communication poles in the state and hold them to the same standard as we do power poles, because we can ask and watch FP&L do everything it needs to do, and it does a great job. But if we don't get the communication poles to be held to the same standard, then it's a weak link that is going to impact us the same way in the next storm.
Great, thank you. And we'll have more time at the end for continued dialogue and discussion. And our next speaker is Professor Karl Kim, who is a professor of urban regional planning at the University of Hawaii and executive director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. I'll ask Karl to introduce his center briefly before he goes into his talk.
Well, good afternoon and aloha. Aloha. You're probably thinking, what the heck is this guy doing here? Actually, it's 5 hours earlier, and so I'm just getting started now. right? Anyway, you all know this. Disasters are the ultimate teachable moments. They tell us what works and what does not. They tell us who has power and who doesn't. And so what I really want to talk about are some of the lessons from disasters and some of the research that I think we need to be doing and focusing on. I guess this thing isn't working after all. This one? Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Well, all right. Well, who am I? So, as John said, I'm a planning professor, but I also direct our disaster management humanitarian assistance center. I know these guys really well because I'm a transportation researcher, and so Scott's stuff was really cool, I think. But anyway, other than a short stint I did as a vice chancellor, the chief academic officer for the University of Hawaii, actually which occurred during 9/11, and then I stayed for about 4 years, and then the Indian Ocean tsunami occurred in 2004, and that's when I kind of left administration and went back to doing the real work as a urban planning professor. But in Hawaii, they know me as Dr. Disaster. So I want to focus on resilience. I'm particularly intrigued these days by extreme events, how we define them, how we manage them, and how we think about them. And it's important to realize that disasters really are all about context. Context is everything. And I think there are certain things we can do to improve our planning and development. And I think another thing that we have to really focus on is recovery planning, all different types of disasters. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then some key opportunities for research, education, and training, and greater collaboration. Actually, there are many similarities between Waikiki and Fort Lauderdale, and I discovered that this morning on my early morning walk. We both have bike share programs that we've implemented. We both have this kind of long coastal area, and we're exposed to many of the same threats and hazards. We do have some hazards in Hawaii that are different. I wanted to show this video that I got. We have active volcanoes, and
Thank God we live in Florida.
Right. We have active volcanoes, and I don't want to show the whole video here. So part of what we try to do is turn our disasters into opportunities. So this particular volcano took over a solid waste station, which closed the waste station, but we turned it into a tourist viewing site. So the visitors could actually look at and we could explain what was happening. We are surrounded by tsunami-generating regions. And so Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, I think there's two things. We're surrounded by the potential for tsunamis, but we also have the hazard of the tyranny of distance. Located in the middle of the Pacific, further away from any other landmass, we are the most remote place in the world. So that's why resilience and being able to survive and being able to shelter in place is really critical. 2015, I think we had 16 named storms in the Central Pacific. This is a composite of all the storms that passed through. And my center is focused on all hazards. It was authorized by Congress, and we have a focus on natural hazards, on coastal communities, and then we also focus on islands and territories as well too. And we focus on all phases of disasters: preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, and with a big emphasis on integrating urban planning, community planning, and dealing with vulnerable at-risk populations. And so what our center does is we develop FEMA-certified training courses on coastal hazards. We did a bunch of courses on hurricanes and tsunamis and coastal flooding. We also did FEMA's first social media class as well too. And social media is important not just for pushing information out, but also for crowdsourcing, and that's really important as well. Getting information from. We're working with where's Brian and his great team on developing a FEMA certified course on evacuation planning. We also do work with drones and UAVs. We've been flying them over the volcano and for many years, and other courses on damage assessment, on debris management, and also now on recovery planning. All of the training courses are offered at no cost to the state and local governments, to NGOs or community groups, and that's what we're in the business of doing. And we've trained now, over the last 5 years, about 33,000 first responders and emergency managers across the U.S. and more than 350 cities and towns. We're part of the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium. I don't know, probably, Mayor, you may be familiar with them because we are FEMA's main training arm. And it includes 4 universities: University of Hawaii, Texas A&M, LSU, and New Mexico Tech. And then it also includes the Nevada Test Site Center for Domestic Preparedness in Anniston, Alabama, and then the Transportation Technology Center in Pueblo, Colorado. Each of us have a specialization. The other centers are principally focused on terrorism and weaponry. Okay. Oh, that. And our center is focused on natural hazards, so we look differently and function a lot more differently than the other centers. But now I want to talk about what I'm really here to talk about, extreme events. When you think about extreme events, it's useful to think about a distribution. Not that there are so many normal distributions now. I mean, you think about income, like with Bill Gates way out here. But just extreme events are things that can occur at the tail ends. They're low probability events. And for things like temperature, we have a long record of temperatures. We can calculate means or averages and then look at what would represent an extreme. And I would point out that the extremes are getting warmer when it comes to temperature. We can look at pressure as well too, like the spectacular drop in atmospheric pressure that occurs with a hurricane. We can also look at the effects of storm surge or coastal flooding that occurs. We can compare the mean high water mark to what happens during a storm. We can look at the amount of rainfall that occurred, like the historic amounts of rainfall that fell during Hurricane Harvey. That was exacerbated, of course, by the amount of impervious surface that we've been creating that created much more flooding in that area. And places that aren't accustomed to flooding experienced an extreme. Obviously, this roadway network was not designed for the flooding that occurred. This is in Missouri during the spring flooding. Next slide. So the other way to think about this is what happens if you have a series of rare events. Harvey, Irma, Maria, Nate, all occurring in the same time and the same general region of the country. And so what we then have are combined events over time and space. So it's important to think about extreme events much more just than the frequency, but also the return period, or how often it is, the duration of the event, and then the clustering of these events that can occur in time and space. Extreme events can also be defined by costs as well, too. It's just abnormally high. Like this year, I think we had $17 billion weather-related events, and 2017 isn't even over, right? And then now there's some recent research that came from MIT, Carrie Emanuel's work about the increased intensity and also increased frequency of these events. And especially for peninsulas like Florida, we have to be concerned about sea level rise, and if we add into it the Arctic or Antarctica ice melt, how much greater the threat will be. And so that there's a lot of displacement that's occurring in communities, in neighborhoods, due to these sorts of changes. We do a lot of work in the Pacific Islands, and in the Pacific Islands, going back, they're really facing existential challenges. And so in Kiribati, they're losing all the lands. Right, okay. There you go. Yeah, this is the president of Kiribati, and what he's trying to do is to help his people to migrate by giving them job skills so that they can move to Australia, New Zealand, and other places as well too. Again, as we talked about earlier today, we really do need to focus on vulnerable populations. It's not just the elderly and those with medical conditions, but other groups as well, like tourists or low-income people or those with limited. And then the other thing that we have to worry about is that when these hazards or threats can occur, there's the potential for criminal activity, there's a potential for additional terrorism or other that may exploit these types of events. You know what the worst threat and hazard is right now in Korea that are in Hawaii? It's the threat of nuclear attack from North Korea, right? And so our emergency management agency, our state emergency management agency, has like pushed out information of what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. But that's really, if we go to the next slide, beyond the design basis. Our communities really weren't designed to withstand nuclear. And we've studied the Fukushima disaster a lot, in part because there were a lot of lessons learned. There were a lot of setbacks. There were a lot of safeguards that were put in place. The site was elevated. There were seawalls that was set back. Somebody earlier said we dodged a bullet with Irma. I was thinking with Turkey Point, other power plants, there are serious threats and hazards to consider. We've been studying Fukushima because of the recovery and remediation efforts. Scraping up all the contaminated soil, packaging it, and how to dispose of it. And I think that there are large questions about the logistics of managing that. And so again, I think resilience really requires that we think about recovery. And that involves really building a different type of capability beyond response. And it has to involve not just good risk assessment, but I think a series of other approaches, which I think are really important. One of the things is to think about, and this is, I know Evangelist did simpler math than this, but this is pretty simple math here. What I want you to consider is 3 different hazards that can hit the same community: riverine flooding, tsunami flooding, and hurricane. Each of these are rare events, let's say 1 in 500-year events. Right? If you look at the probability of any one of them, it's 1 over 500, which is a rare event. But if you look at the same place that could be impacted by the same 3 hazards, it's actually 1 over 166. Right? So it's a much more common frequency. The benefit to this is you can look at joint benefit analysis as well too. So, but again, it isn't the hurricane. It isn't the tsunami. It's actually the specific breakdowns that occur, the loss of power, the loss of communications, that people get hurt or their lives get disrupted. So it's really important to think about how these different hazards and threats affect the really harm-causing elements. Hawaii was just awarded, Honolulu was just awarded one of the 100 resilient cities. I know that Miami Beach is also that. There's a lot of thought and effort. We work in many of those cities in Asia as well too. How do you measure resilience in terms of robustness, flexibility, the ability to recover quickly from disasters? And so increasingly more and more metrics are coming out. There's some ideas that one of the things that we're looking at, we do a lot of work in Korea. They took a drainage project. This is the Cheonggyecheon project. It was an elevated highway. They dismantled the highway, restored the stream that was through there, and improved the drainage in this area, created a new area for greater investment, and then also created a great people space. It's kind of hard to see, but it actually has made the city much more functional and attractive. And then the other thing, and I was just there 2 weeks ago, what they've done in their emergency management is combine together multiple hazards and threats. So they not only worry about natural disasters or the attack from North Korea, they also worry about car accidents in the same center. They also keep track of crime statistics and suicides. Right? And map and model and use all these different technologies to bring this all together, because you're dealing with the same first responders and emergency managers and others that have to deal with many of these types of hazards and threats. So some concluding threats. I mean, there are multiple hazards and threats, and what we have to do is break down the stovepipes and look for the synergies between. I think the city scale, I think the best job in the world is to be a mayor, right? Because you really have an opportunity to make a difference.
Of the city of Hollywood.
Yeah, right. I mean, and I think because cities, they allow you to do things at a strategic level and make changes. And the real innovation comes at the city level, not at the national level. And then the other thing that we really want to stress is integrating planning and land use and development. And how can we prevent really bad development from occurring that puts more people at risk, that just passes the cost down and so forth. And I think that there are new exciting technologies to reduce some of the rigidities and brittleness of our systems. I wish we could have spent more with our architecture professor talking about ways in which you can make mid-century modern architecture actually more sturdy as well too, and better able to withstand climate change. And so I think it's important to integrate research and education and training, and then focus on extreme event analysis. And I would argue that the resilience dividends isn't just reducing the risk of people getting killed or hurt or losing their homes, but also really think about how you can do this stuff to improve the quality of life. And I think resilience is linked to innovation now. And so with that, I'd like to say that there are some things we can do. Come join us in Hawaii for the Primo annual conference. If you're a student and you want to come to University of Hawaii, come see me. If you're interested in developing a training course with our center or having, we have partnerships with other universities as well too. Again, we train in many cities. I'll have to check if we've trained in Hollywood, but I know we've trained throughout Florida and other. So I think that there are certain partnerships we can establish on focusing on coastal resilience, on tourism, and work together to build capacity.
All right.
I'm
Thank
all
you.
about going to Hawaii. I like that.
Can we get the house lights back up in the back? Or you have, oh wait, you have a video. I'm sorry, no, maybe, no. Let's hold off on the lights. Sorry, I forgot. So, Karl, thank you so much. And while Patxi gets set up, questions from the audience. Brian?
Karl, one of the cool things about that you do that I know that you do a lot of, but I don't really know the details of it, is you go to a lot of kind of crazy developing countries where they don't really have the infrastructure that we have, and the complex plans that we have, and all these other things. How do they view, is emergency management and resilience and those kind of things viewed the same in those areas, and are there things that because they're at a, I don't want to say less complex level, but they just do really, really well that we can learn from? Any instances like that?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I have to say that it's really all about context. And they do some things much better than we do, and other things that we do better. And I think part of it has to be understanding how governance. And earlier today, I guess, when Aubrey was talking about the different types of communities to work in many of the countries that we work in, the government system has failed or fails to deliver even basic services. And so the role of NGOs or community groups, volunteer organizations are really, really critical. They don't come to expect during the normal times that their local government is going to provide the type of protection that we've grown accustomed to. And so that makes many of the people, the citizens, much more resilient and eager to learn and to change and to adapt. So, yeah, in some places, and stronger community organization, because there isn't this expectation that that government is going to be there or will provide for them.
All right, and our last speaker is going to be Patxi Pastor with Celebration of the Seas Foundation and Key Strong.
Great, thank you. So, first of all, it's always a joy and an honor to be with FAU. Colin and John, thanks for having us. Karl, and anytime you're with the mayor, this is interesting. I came here in '05, and that was a year of a lot of hurricanes. I moved to the Keys, and in that particular time frame, what we learned, at least I learned at that particular time, was there were things that this isn't going to be our last season of hurricanes. It just continues. So instead of being reactive, I think the opportunity to be proactive. So it was a kind of a wonderfully and apt title, Lessons Learned. Because the real issue here with everything we can do, everyone has a different view and a discipline in terms of a perspective on this. It's really exciting to see when you have the academics and the civic leaders, everybody coming together, again with FAU's help to glue us together. And then the other thing we're pushing on right now, which is really exciting, is engaging the asset holders, the business community, which has been missing. We've all kind of agreed for a long time, and that's changing. So what we've been doing for a long time is it's on engagement. Unless you get people to pay attention, and people are busy, and it's hard to get people to kind of focus, especially now that it's kind of getting behind us. A month passed, 2 months passed. You had Harvey, these poor folks in Houston are still digging out. Irma, the Keys, and obviously Puerto Rico with Maria. And it keeps coming. And as the cameras leave, I think what happens is that the relevance and kind of that emotional connection is gone. So in '05, the Keys, as an example, when you talk about Irma in Monroe County, it's very much a tourism-driven economy. So without that tourism, the families really hurt. So in addition to the devastation of the hurricane, the impact of that economically is extraordinary. So as a kind of an event marketing guy, in '05, if you want to go to the next slide, down in the Keys, I produced in '05 a big concert with Steven Tyler and a bunch of supermodels. And we tried to bring people, this was in July, and they were double mortgaging houses, people couldn't feed their families. So we brought 10,000 people down to the Keys for a big concert. How do you get people down here and enjoying them and get them back in the restaurants and the hotels? So that was July 30th, mosquitoes and rain and tough time, but you couldn't get a bed from Homestead all the way down to Key West, so we were very proud of that. Rouse Marina, 10,000 people, and the next act we had Chuck Berry, and you just could go to this. This was about the joy and trying to get people kind of back into the Keys, but also as they came in, we had a large activation about the animals and the critters and the community and getting people kind of the relevance of the science and education, which is a huge piece of this puzzle. But this one was different. Irma, I want to show you this crisis relief team, which are a wonderful team that work with us. Go to this next slide. This shows you the impact, and it's so profound. This was a drone that was shot in one of the neighborhoods from Cudjoe Key, Big Pine Marathon, where it was heaviest hit. I've been going down every weekend, and we've started this amazing organization, which I'll tell you about. Go ahead and hit one more time, and it'll play for you. So this is the impact. If you can imagine that you took a town, and it's not just the wind, it's the storm surge, everything that combines into the impact of what this will do to your neighborhood and to your life. So it's well beyond the economics, the transportation, the communications. There is a toll that takes emotional and spiritual impact on a community that is very complicated to even comprehend how to deal with that when this is affecting children and families long after FEMA does their best to help. It's really what can we all do to learn from these things so that we have the infrastructure in place to be able to aid our community to rebuild itself and to repair itself. And if you look at that, you're talking about cars and trailers and mattresses, and that's basically an entire community that gets poured into the intercoastal city. If we go to the next slide, this goes on for a while. I want to show you, when we talk about not just wind, but storm surge, this is right outside of like Isla Mirada, Marathon area. I think this is Marathon. This was a 3-story house, and this was about 1 to 2 feet of storm surge. This, if you go ahead and play, this will pan. This is a 3-story house that you see the 2 stories gone and the 3rd story coming down and crushing on itself. But a lot of people that the cameras are gone, they don't see this anymore. And this is all still down there. Every time I go down every weekend, you just feel the connection. If you go to the next slide, this is what it's like when you take a town and you shake it up and you pour it on a table. Go ahead, and this is about 30 feet of just people's lives stacked on A1A as far as you can see. And every day, the poor mayors are trying to deal every day with how do you deal with this? The infrastructure, it's so beyond the relevance in terms of the mass, the magnitude. This is people's lives, it's communities. So what we realized that 10 years ago, if we had put things in place when we had those hurricanes when I was down there, the concert was fine, and I'm pleased to be doing lots of that, and I continue to. I'll tell you about another one we're about to do. But the real opportunity when you talk about the lessons of Irma is what can we put in place to be proactive so all this stuff is ready? Because it was so big and so complicated. Let me just take you through a couple things we've done. The spirit of the Keys, when you talk about Irma, one of the lessons is the resiliency and that emotional connection people have to a place that they love. Keys Strong was this theme that kept coming up, if you go to the next one. And this was an issue that we basically took in terms of a brand and a spirit, and actually embodied it to be something to bring everybody together. All of Monroe County and all the mayors working with us, something we're very proud of. So you go to the next slide. So we set up an organization called keysstrong.org with all of the mayors, so there'd be representation from all the different communities in the Keys, the opportunity to bring people together to how do you deal with the transportation, how do you deal with the homeless, how do you deal with the food, how do you deal with the communication. So where FEMA and the government was doing its best, this was so big, it really required all of us to work together, to also not just learn from it, but have it in place, so the next time, all the things that we learned could be leveraged immediately, the lessons from Hurricane Irma. So we brought together all of these different wonderful organizations, and now literally there's dozens more. They're being added all the time. But so keysstrong.org, if you look at what the lessons from Hurricane Irma, what we're specifically trying to do is to take all of the specific things that we did learn, with the help of all the mayors, bringing together all these wonderful people on this executive committee to try to figure out how we can provide the mechanics from the civic side to support what you guys are all doing and being helped from the government side, but with the civic leaders all working together, have this in place to really rock and roll when we need it, right? Next slide. So we set up immediately, which it didn't exist, we needed a paywall. How do you donate money? If you go to the next slide, that had to be set up. How do you actually volunteer? That's set up. How do you actually give goods and services? There were 17 tractor trailers. I brought down with some friends at Entercom, which I'll talk about, 17 tractor trailers were turned away because they had no place to put it. They didn't know how to offload it. You need to have people there, and you need to have forklifts, and you need to have warehouses, and a lot of that simply was people didn't know what to do with it. So this was another thing. How do we learn that lesson? So we also have set up with the generosity of Jonathan Smith, who owns all these radio stations now, from Havana, Cuba, all the way to the Bahamas. Every morning we have Key Strong Radio with messages about where you can get help, if it's emotional, if it's financial, if you need legal, if you need to get some resources for an electrician or somebody doing drywall. We're trying to figure out how to provide all those particular resources. And what you said was really interesting. With the social media, it's not just the linear outflow, it's the ability to get that information back from people. And how powerful is that? Everyone's carrying their phone to share, right? Next one. So we set up the social media, which is a big piece of this, which we're working on. All the stuff you're seeing today is being broadcast there as well, because we want to especially engage the millennials and those kids, because they're moving the needle right now. They're not asleep at the wheel. These kids are rocking. So the next one here. So Wyland was generous enough to donate some art, so we had to put like a face on this thing, create really a brand. You need to, this is the day and age of brands, right? So Hurricane Irma, the lesson was, what's the brand? So if we go to the next slide. So then we started to create this look and feel so the public could engage it. You can go through these. So this is all going live right now, the sites, the merchandise, things like that. Guy Harvey stepped in like Wyland did, and all these wonderful people that represent the lifestyle of the fishing, of the diving, all of that. And everybody wanted to help. It was a question of where we could do it together. So it wasn't confusing to the public, but have one unified voice. Next slide. So we've been putting all of this information on our website, and I'd encourage you guys, if you want to help us to make Keys Strong a link, if you have any resources that you can leverage that and get the word out. We've also, if you click this once, we've been doing large festivals. So you can click through that. But anyhow, when we do these live events, Elmira Lito, that woman you'll see in a minute, I met her feeding in her parking lot, 1,800 people. A 68-year-old woman was feeding 1,800 people in her parking lot. And that's the kind of thing where people just get it done, you know? So this weekend, actually, I'm very honored to be the official charity for the Riptide Festival. And the idea here is that every year as we engage this whole topic about resiliency and getting kids specifically excited about STEM careers, if you take a bunch of kids today and you ask them, how many of you kids want to be an architect? How many of you kids want to be an engineer? Not a lot of hands go up. And if you think about the kind of careers that we need, thank God for FAU and Broward College and NOVA and FIU, all these guys working together, we got to get these kids excited about these careers because there are millions of jobs out there, and the career paths are what's missing, that connectivity and that excitement. We got to get those kids excited. And so these large-scale activations that we're doing, next slide, it's all about trying to get these resources with these media companies and get the word out. It's the engagement, because kids are all about that today, especially with social media. Next slide. So what we've been doing as part of this strategy is they just bought CBS Radio, and they have now 7 stations. So every week, 5 million listeners that we can reach with a message. But then the question is, what is the message? So if there's a clearly defined call to action, if you want to help, and it comes to do with resiliency, and the mayors know the challenge, right? What do you tell people? Where do they donate? Where do they go? If they've got gasoline, they've got chainsaws, they've got skills. It's that database and the organization, all of that, the people want to help. It's a question of building that infrastructure, right? Next slide. So what we started doing is we started bringing the media down to the Keys, and this was a lesson we learned the hard way. So imagine 5 million people a week that we can say, hey, you want to help the Keys? Come on down. And then we said, oh my God, if people start volunteering, so the phones start ringing. Who's going to deal with the volunteers? Who's going to deal with the trucks? Who's going to deal with chainsaws? We didn't have the infrastructure. So they started putting the links. Go ahead. And so Ashley O from the Shark, as an example, she came down, dropped everything they were doing, and Intercom hopped in their cars. They came down the Keys with me. We were doing live remotes with the mayors and everybody, trying to get people to help. We didn't even know we didn't have Keys Strong. We didn't have a website. We didn't have a place for people to donate. We didn't have a place for people to show up or volunteer. So go ahead and play it for a second.
Hi, I've got Jim Mooney, Mayor of Isla Morada, and we are in
There's that house you saw a second ago behind them.
Quite a devastating scene here. This is Hurricane Irma.
So this is all on our website. For purposes of time, you can look at the full thing later. But go to the next one. So then also Rick Ramsey was the head commander. You talk about lessons from Hurricane Irma. We were learning one here.
Rick?
Yes, ma'am.
So we're on the road to Riptide, and basically what has happened is we wanted to partner with somebody who loved beaches like we do here in
Okay,
South
so you get the
Florida,
idea.
and then
So if you're interested, these are all on our website. The point was that there wasn't a unified message for all those leaders in terms of the call to action. You need a one clear call to action. Where do you go and what do you do? Especially the one thing we learned is when CNN and everybody was there with the cameras and you have millions of people watching, the huge tragedy was that millions of dollars worth of media, cameras left, and that message could have been clear from day one. Donate here, if you got skills, go here, if you want to volunteer, go here. That, to me, the one thing we did learn, because that's priceless. When you have the emotional connection, and you know, Americans are awesome. They want to help, but they need to know how. So that was one of the biggest lessons we learned. Go ahead. So next thing. The stuff starts coming in. We didn't even have a warehouse. So a guy with a restaurant, very generous guy in Key West, donated a warehouse. This is what it looks like when you have a lot of people who are well-intended. Lessons from Hurricane Irma. What do you do? Where do you put it? How do you shelf it? How do you distribute it? It just was mayhem, controlled chaos, with nothing but wonderful people trying to help, but the infrastructure was gone. This is my car. So every week when I would go down there, then how do you get to distribute it, right? Now we got it in the Keys. Now we've got it stored. Now, how do you get it to the families? And you're talking about people who are living under blue tarps, living in their cars a month and a half, 2 months later. They're still there, believe me. So every time I was there, I would throw the diapers and the baby formula and the stuff in the car. Lessons from Hurricane Irma. Now, how do we distribute it? Next one. Okay. This was after the Seafood Festival, which we were also the charity for. A woman heard us talk, and she said, I have a truck full of organic hummus. Would you want it? And I said, of course, I'll take anything you got, right? Problem is, it's got to be refrigerated. We didn't even think of that one, right? So at 3 o'clock in the morning, I find a guy in the Keys, God bless this guy who owns Shipwrecks, who allowed us to put 214 pounds of boxes of hummus from my car because I need to refrigerate it at 3 in the morning. But this is all the stuff that we learned the hard way, right? Everybody wanted to help. It was just the organization. Next one. Okay, so I asked everybody, I said, listen, where do we donate money? Red Cross, United Way, they all mean well, but a lot of that money goes to even overhead, which you have to have, but a lot of that's in Washington or somewhere else. As long as there are going to be people fed and there's jobs for administrative or operational, it might as well be for community help from those particular people. Go ahead and play this. So I said, find me some woman, click one more time. You can turn the sound off for a second. So I said, find me somebody who's actually out there on the front lines with the families. So this is when I found this woman, Elmira Lito, Samuel's house, for 20 years. The governor actually elected her as the woman of the year for Florida. So this is her parking lot feeding 1,800 people, 68-year-old woman doing it herself. And that tractor trailer you'll see in the shot, some guy from Deerfield Beach filled up with ribs and brisket, he and his brother, yep. And they came down. So when the Red Cross was doing its best to feed people, I was hearing it wasn't so appetizing. That looks like a pretty good meal, right? So then the next question is, we need a way to distribute even the food. Now the food is brought down to the Keys. Now it's cooked. Now it's prepared. Now it's actually contained. Now you have to distribute it. So that woman brought about 400 meals to a convalescent home with old people who are basically just sitting there and more frightened than anything. Even a volunteer that could sit and hold their hand would have been extraordinary. So not to go through this, but with the Tourist Development Council, if you just hit play quickly, Gloria Stefan donated a song, the relationship between the entertainment community, Jimmy Buffett, all these guys just did concerts. She donated a song, the TDC put this video together, this is all on YouTube. But one of the other things that we started looking at is when you have these messages that are in social media, the call to action, which is the big piece of now what do you do when you get people or millions of people watching these videos? It should have a big website down there saying go to this site and this is how you can help. Next one. This was still the lesson which we're struggling with. ABC News, millions of people watching. I don't know if you saw this piece, go ahead and play it and I'm done. The entire piece was about the impact that Hurricane Irma had on the Keys, but there was not one call to action. Millions of people watching it. How do I help? So if anything we've learned the hard way is that there's nothing but a wonderfully intended general public out there, you can go, then thanks for listening. So the one thing we did learn is the spirit of the Keys, people don't, what Elmira Lito, who you just saw, always says, they don't want a hand out, they want a hand up. But the biggest lesson, and thank you for allowing me to share that, as a guy who's been going down to ground zero almost every weekend and trying to help put some of this together, is everybody is super well intended. I think the need in this particular connection people have to help others is always there. But hopefully, Mayor, with you and the others getting together and providing that leadership, the glue is that all these particular activities can be super effective and actually result in something that's actionable but clear with a single voice. So that's what keystrong.org is. So I encourage you, if you can stop by and check out the website and help promote it, we're very grateful. And thank you, FAU, for having us.
Thank you so much,
Keystrong.org. All right.
Great, excellent. Can we get the house? So the reason that I am standing here in front of you right now is because I lived through that exact same story in New Orleans in 2005 through 2000, and I don't know, it just kept going until eventually one day it was kind of back to normal. And and as a part of that process, I met the big tall guy standing in the back there, Brian Wolshon, who's a professor at LSU. And I called up Brian on the phone back in the fall of 2005, and he had been, written so much stuff on evacuations. And I said, Brian, I want to work with you. We need to figure out how to do this better, right? And then over the last 12 or 13 years since then, right? Brian introduced me to Karl, and one of the things that we've recognized is that we need to bring a partnership together, and this is why I think Patxi has been so fabulous, is that, the academics, we kind of gather together and we show equations like Evangelist showed, right, and Scott, and we get excited about that, right? But how does that influence the real world, right? Some of the folks are sitting here who are working, mayors and emergency managers, right? And we've recognized as academics that we can work with local government, and we get together with local government and we share these sorts of ideas, which is the intention of what I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes. But now we're taking it to a new level, because organizations like Evacuatier and like other numerous organizations that had sprouted up in New Orleans and Louisiana and in New York after Sandy, right? They're starting to better engage the public. And this is what Patxi's doing. So really groundbreaking is to figure out, how do we bring this stuff to everybody, right? How do we bring it to everybody? And it shouldn't just be about the recovery. It really should be about the stuff that, Steve Barassa, who I didn't introduce earlier, is the director of our School of Urban Planning, my colleague, Karl, Kim, and I, right? We teach in urban planning programs, right? We train people that work for your local governments about how do you build buildings? How do you make it more resilient? How do you design transportation systems with the engineers to be more resilient? So let's take the next 20 minutes and brainstorm. And what I'd ask is, Serena, would you mind? What I want to do is I want to capture, right? We'll just put up a Word document, just ideas, brainstorming ideas. How can we as academics do more relevant research? How can city people working for local, state government, federal government, what do you need to do your job better? And folks like Patxi, who have their finger on the pulse of the community, the media, what is it that you guys can use for us? So let's just open it up for questions and ideas. Anyone want to kick it off? I guess I'll start with one question. How can we do what you're doing, the Key Strong, you're talking about, if this is on CNN, right? And you know, people are always willing to donate to help out in the aftermath. How do we turn that around to make people more excited about preparedness, right? How do we make that sexy and exciting? Because frankly, it doesn't seem to be, people don't seem to care much about preparedness, right? They always seem to care when a disaster strikes on how they can help, but how can we get people more excited about being better prepared? So I'll ask that question, and I want this to be a discussion with everyone here in the room. We're a small group now, and I think everybody can share ideas. So who would like to take that idea? Yeah,
So I think that really is so important, and everything that you showed was sort of implementing what we know, the power of media and the power of gaining and collecting the cooperation of so many people who want to give, whether it's volunteer hours or being able to quickly be able to harness the desire to donate. But your issue about preparedness, I think it comes down to what Patxi was explaining, was the way in which you market and gain the participation through a unified message, a good media message that can also be implemented for preparedness. So the beginning of hurricane season comes, suddenly it's, you know, I don't know, Hollywood Get Ready initiative, and we mobilize and get people aware and excited about, you know, this mutual effort that we do as a community. So I think those same things that you did post-storm could also be effective in a preparedness type of,
Karl?
situation.
You know, I think it's really important to try to mainstream or build resilience thinking into our day-to-day activities. So it's not just that this horrible thing could happen, but how can we really address existing problems and weaknesses and in the face of different types of hazards and threats. I remember when we first started doing this work with the hotels, they didn't want to scare the tourists, for example, right? They don't want, but I think it's really important to educate and not just the tourists, but also the workers and the employees and others in the community about the importance of resilience building. And I think it has a physical dimension, and what I really like about your work is that you're thinking about the social dimension as well too. It's so easy to think about how do we harden our structures? How do we make our buildings more strong or our infrastructure so it doesn't collapse? But if you were to think about that in the context of the social systems, the social networks, I mean, we've been struggling to do this course on social capital, on how do people form trust relationships, relationships of reciprocity. I mean, people will help their families generally, right? They may help their neighbors and some of their friends, right? But how do you get to a point where actually strangers will help strangers? Because that's what happens when a disaster occurs. It overwhelms the local capacity, it overwhelms business as usual, and I think it's going to require some real transformation to be able to get to that point. And I think that there are really important lessons right now to learn from these communities in terms of how they're recovering from these disasters. I mean, it's one thing to think about emergency response and the relief stuff, but really the hard work is the long-term recovery. How do you make it so that people just don't say, well, I've had it, I'm leaving, I'm never coming back here again. You're losing residents, you're losing tax base, you're losing so much. And so and we've been doing this work with the Kettering Foundation on how do you deliberate disasters. And we know people want to build back fast. They really want it back as quickly as possible, right? They want to build back stronger. But can you build back better? Can you create a culture or an awareness where you're not just more resilient against disasters, but you're actually a better community? And so that's what I think you're working on.
So I want to pick on the folks here from Evacuatier because they are able to motivate 500 people a year to continue to volunteer year after year after year when, fortunately, New Orleans has had a dry spell, hasn't had any major hurricanes for a while. It was, could have been closed this past year, but they do some really cool things like parties and so there's everything from the entertainment to the seriousness. So I want to ask them, what have your experiences been?
So really, with maintaining volunteer engagement, it is an uphill battle, and it takes all of your energy every day, pretty much. We recruit 500 volunteers, but we start that back at zero from every year to year because we want to make sure that the next year people are still on board to serve with us, that they still live in New Orleans, that they still remember us, and that they still want to be involved. We do try to do like regular happy hours. We have an end of hurricane season party where we really try to get people, to buy in from the, training, like our first contact with them, like, hey, sign on to volunteer. Like we always do this volunteer appreciation event, free food, free, drinks, and just to let you know how much we appreciate your commitment, because it is a huge ask that we are asking people, to stick around a little bit longer than they might feel comfortable normally. In the event of a mandatory evacuation. I've thought of other ideas too with kind of making people more feel proud to be a volunteer with us, like having a membership card maybe where local businesses recognize our volunteers. I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities there. But yeah, the engagement part, I mean, just for us to be such a small staff and try to keep our hands on 500 people is a challenge, so. I don't know if you want to.
Okay, I want someone from the audience to ask a question. Yeah.
Well, I was in talking about preparedness. I think one of the things that around the country, people get amnesia, storm amnesia. And in Florida, I was a regional person before, and I found in the southeastern United States, it was tough to get people excited. But in Florida, we do hurricanes often enough that we don't get the amnesia. But I think it becomes institutional also because I think it's 1948 was the last time a child died in a school fire in the United States. But yet kids drill every single month. Every child in the United States does a fire drill, and they don't even think about it. They don't get excited about it. They do it, and it saves lives. And I think we have a governor right now in Florida that was promoting early on in the season, be prepared, be prepared. And in the past, we used to do the big rallies down here every year, have a plan, be a plan, help someone with a plan, all these mottos. But really, when it comes down to it, I find it's very institutional. Healthcare facilities are very prepared. They drill, they get prepared in May and June. Other industries, not so much. And the general, Joe Blow on the street, he gets amnesia because he says, well, I haven't had a storm in a couple of years. That plywood's long gone. And then the first storm, everybody, gets ready for it. So I think it's institutional, but it's also cultural too, depending on what you've been through. The one thing I found a little strange talking about the Keys is there was no mention of schools. And I think there's a major disconnect between the public and the private sector where when it comes to schools, we don't want to let contractors in there because of the danger of being around the kids, but there's a huge need, especially in the Keys right now. School was only in, I think, 3 weeks. All those classrooms were destroyed. Teachers that invested their own dollars, they're hurting at home. So we've been working with the schools down there to help, the kids get back, get clothes, get prom stuff set up for prom next year because these kids lost everything. But I find that, it's very institutional in certain areas.
What would you say is either a research need or a need that, in general, most local governments need to be thinking about, in terms of all that we've been talking about?
I think the mayor said it well when he said, getting that excitement every year. If we go 10 years without a hurricane, like what happened with Andrew, that was the biggest reason for the damage. It wasn't the strength of the storm, it was our unpreparedness. Someone said we dodged a bullet. We didn't dodge a bullet. The entire state of Florida was hit by this storm. It was the worst ever, So when we say dodge bullets, some had a little worse than others, but we all got hit. So I think that the biggest thing would be for our local municipalities to keep the residents, fired up about it. And even coming up with volunteer committees and things like that, just to get people's minds wrapped around it. We have huge volunteerism here in South Florida.
We got 1, 2, 3.
Population of our universities.
I just wanted to point out that I think one of the few things that we don't think about is you're talking about a culture of preparedness, right, here in Florida. We've got a culture of preparedness in New Orleans as well, but Americans are increasingly mobile, and every year you've got a large influx of people that this is their very first storm season, right? So you do have some of that amnesia, 10 years, 11 years post-Katrina, but you also have tons of new citizens. And so one of the things that we've been brainstorming at Evacuatier is how do you promote that culture on an annual basis? Should it be a mailer in your new residence package? Should it be coming with your utility bill? How do you get city buy-in to really promote that year after year and make it institutional so that when you move to a new area, you're aware of the risks and the hazards in your region?
That's a great point. When Hurricane Matthew hit Florida 2016, there hadn't been a hurricane in about a decade, and over that period of time, there had been hundreds of thousands of new residents that had moved to the state. So we have a hand over here, we got one back there, and I saw one over there and one then over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what this gentleman said. I was thinking the same thing about fire drills. And sometimes kids come home. I have 2 grown kids. Kids come home and they tell the parents, you shouldn't smoke in bed, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. They know the drills and they know safety regulations that they've learned in school. When you go on a cruise, even if it's a short one, you're given safety drills. We have to have emergency preparedness integrated into the fabric of life. And adults have a hard time changing, right? But kids are much more malleable. Start with the kids all the way through college, you know, and integrate it into the fabric of life so it's not just once a year it's hurricane season, oops, maybe we better do something, check if we have our shutters in place or whatever, but that it's a year-round phenomenon. And the sea is not going to go back down. It's rising all the time. We have to deal with the realities. I just wrote a book about adapting to the public health impact of climate change. We have to adapt and we have to mitigate. We can't ignore it and put our heads in the sand, but our kids and our teenagers and college students can really take the lead on this. I mean, it's wonderful. I loved what all the panelists had to say, but they can't do it alone. The whole community has to participate. The other thing that's been helpful, I was an EPA project manager last year, and we went through an NGO that's very proactive in environmental work. So get the NGOs working with the government, working with the universities. Some of them are faith-based, some are other charitable organizations. We all have to work together on this and put aside our other differences and work together to keep people safe.
Can I
will
say
tell
one
you, though.
thing? So one thing, one of the other challenges we learned is that in order to have people care and volunteer or help, they have to be emotionally connected. So as a tourism-based economy and real estate-based economy, you used to see an article in the paper or on TV, maybe it was once a month, about sea level rise and we're flooding and everybody should move out and this doom and gloom. Then it was once a week, then once a day. Now it's literally many a day. So the reoccurring theme with our brand equity as a community is we're in big trouble and we're going down. So what's really interesting is that the blend of messaging, when you come to the engagement side, if you don't show those pictures that I just showed you, you won't engage people to want to volunteer help. If you show those pictures, the people who we need in the Keys to go diving, to get on those fishing boats, to get in the restaurants, to go into the hotels, many of which won't be open for another half a year, the message is very confusing. So number one, you have to have a hopeful, come down, have a safe weekend with your family. We need, in order to help the Keys, go down there and have fun. Get in that restaurant, go diving, go fishing. That's how we spark the economy. The difficulty with that is the happier you paint the picture when you see a lot of the fantasy fest going on, and that was a really difficult time because people were actually, FEMA people that were in hotels were asked to get out of the hotels with no place to go so the tourists could have a place to sleep. It was very complicated, right? But the message in terms of this, we have an infrastructure here that's about a $1.5 billion challenge with 70-year-old infrastructure. Let's just take Broward County. So the exciting thing, and I'm thrilled and honored to work closely with FAU and all these guys here, Alec who's in the back chomping at the bit to talk. There's amazing people with the Chamber of Commerce and everybody all now working together with what do we do to take this whole story, and instead of having it be this really scary story, what if in the next 10 or 20 years this was the most extraordinary, resilient community in the world? We have to rebuild it anyhow. So why not flip it and turn it into an extraordinary, positive, hopeful, wonderful, let's have a happy ending with this story, right? So they did it, 1.5 billion, and you know, from the mayors, you don't come up with that money easily. It's not going to come out of Tallahassee. It's not going to come out of Washington. So like the port, like the airport, these are P3s, private partnerships, private-public partnerships. But how exciting that these kind of conversations begin with people say yes. Like Kennedy, 10 years we're going to put a man on the moon. Everyone said, you're crazy. What are you making a statement like that? Why can't we make a statement? In 10 or 20 years, we're going to have the most resilient community in the world. Broward County is going to rock and roll. You want to see how we get it right? We're going to get it right here. And it's meetings like this with all you guys that have got the passion and we're going to go one way or the other, right? They're either going to, the media is a keeps it feeds itself. It's either going to keep spitting the same stuff, it's going to do what it has to do, or we're going to give it something really exciting and hopeful to talk about, right? So let's give it something great to talk about. So all your ideas, and thank you for allowing me to kind of chime in. But Alec, there's one of the smartest guys I know. Go ahead, Alec. Chime on in, brother. Love this guy.
That was a lie. So since we're talking about academia, one of the kind of big gaps I see in terms of how we train folks is, you know, we're sitting here in a room full of people, most of which aren't subject matter experts, and yet we don't teach engineers and scientists how to communicate with the general public. And that's the first. And we also don't include risk communication as part of our curriculum. I went to school for meteorology, and we have weather folks on TV telling us what to do and to evacuate, and most of them have never taken a risk communication course or understand that, what risk communication is, what that means, how people react to things, giving them information that causes a fight or flight mechanism as opposed to, yes, we can handle this. So I'd be curious kind of what your thoughts are in terms of how we better teach folks to be communicators and not just think about teaching them the technical skills.
Great point. Karl, you want to take that one?
I want to respond first to something that Patxi said, which I think that's really, I think you're right. There's two ways we can try to motivate people. One way is you can try to scare them. And we see a lot of scare tactics being used. And the effects sometimes are more immediate with that people get a reaction to that. But I think another way is to build hope or create a notion of stewardship, of responsibility. And I think that that's the way to go with this. This whole issue about risk communication, I teach these courses too. And so, and one of the things that I fear is that our country is becoming really anti-science. And for a variety of reasons, which I just don't get. And part of the difficulty is that we're not really advocating enough for science, for scientific inquiry, for the types of work that really we should be investing in. And I agree that it's important to have our engineers and scientists and others be part of a larger community. And what I think about resilience is there is a need to break down the different disciplinary stovepipes. That it isn't just about structural engineering, but also mechanical and engineering, and also it's about land use and planning and design and architecture and public health, and pretty soon it gets really sloppy really quick, and a lot of academics aren't trained that way. A lot of academics, they don't want to be in that space. They want their narrow, defined space, and so we have to make some larger sort of structural changes in order to fight these kinds of complex, difficult challenges that we as a society face.
I'll tell you real quick, though, regarding risk communication and the whole gathering volunteers, exciting people to get involved, what have you. Let's look at the bright side. There's never been a better time in the history of media and our ability to communicate with social media, the devices we hold in our hand, the different ways in which you can communicate with people. There's never been a better time to be able to disseminate information quickly, to gain engagement quickly, and for everybody to spread it, organically, that it spreads faster than what you can ever have imagined. So I think we're in a very exciting time of being able to get people together to join in a collective desire to help other people. And so, knowing how to harness the power of the communication methods that we have through social media and otherwise is a fun time, and really it's part and parcel of the world today. It's how you can reach people. When we were in the midst of Hurricane Irma, I was on Facebook Live we were Facebook living from the city, departments. Residents were getting their information, their local information, through that social feed more so than watching CNN. So it's changing. So if we know how to use it, then we're more effective, and we're a lot more of a community in that regard. It's, wow, the mayor is giving me tips. It's right here. It's Hollywood. It's my city, as opposed to a generic message. So really awesome and fun opportunity that we all have.
The other thing that's missing, at least when I was a kid, I was watching those guys bounce around on the moon. We had kids. We were number one in the world. We lost it. What are we, 27th now? I think on our watch, we've let it. But the kids need role models, especially females and minorities. We got to get these scientists to be rock stars. And that's what media is easily done with if we can actually frame it right. So that kid, that little girl sees that marine biologist diving or flying drones or in a robot and says, I want to be like that girl in a robot. So it was all of us as kids when we watched those guys bounce around on the moon, or I became a diver because I saw Cousteau every weekend. And I couldn't wait to watch that little Frenchman and what he was going to build. It was a robot or a submarine or a balloon or a plane, and the plane floats. I mean, everything the guy did was cool, right? I said, I want to be that little Frenchman. But I think the kids, what Alec is saying in terms of this communication thing, it's easy to provide the platform if we can provide some of these little rock stars, those little female and minority rock stars that are into science, engineering, architecture, all those stream careers. Recreation and the arts I put in there too. It's a long story, but that's what I think we're really missing, which would be cool, to make it cool. Science.
So we have our last question here, but after that we're going to do a mandatory evacuation, and unlike the city of Hollywood, you're all going to be forced to evacuate to the Tarpon Bend.
The
There's
after
going to
party.
be lots of food and drinks there.
I think
You're
that's a
not-
voluntary evacuation,
No,
actually.
it's mandatory. We have a lot of food and drinks,
Yeah.
and you have to go there, or else you'll be arrested and thrown in jail. But our last question is Glenn, who's retired emergency manager with Broward County.
Well, I'd like to make an observation as an urban planner that, something that's of a concern is the ability to keep something going. Right now I think that there's a lot of, a particular community gets hit, and you can get things interest, but keeping that interest up there is always difficult. We don't all have strong leaders like, Mayor Levy, or great communicators, like Patxi. But something that I think that I've always felt very strongly about, is plan consistency. There are literally hundreds of plans within Broward County, and the consistency is somewhat sketchy. While I was in emergency management, we did a study of about 13 different, the comp plan, the emergency management plan, recovery plan, and the historic preservation plan, and looked at consistency, and we pointed out a number of areas where they were inconsistent. Land use plan, there's got to be consistency in these plans, because if you're talking about what's going to happen 10 years from now, it's these plans and the consistency of these plans that will actually drive that. And then as an emergency management, professional for a number of years, and retired now, I guess I'd like to ask a question. How many people here are familiar with incident command structure? That is encouraging, but it's something that I think everyone needs to become aware of. It's how disasters are handled, and if you don't understand how things are being, decisions are being made and where information is coming from, you run into the problems such as, hey, let's get all this material in here, and you get all that stuff, and just like in New Orleans, they had stadiums full of volunteered items that they threw away. They had to take bulldozers to get rid of it, and that became more of a problem. Volunteers descending on a place, and you don't have, a volunteer reception center set up before you make that announcement. So by becoming familiar with that and coordinating that well in advance of the disaster, you don't want to wait until the disaster to be doing these things, but understand who's in charge of these things. There's emergency support functions that are set up that,
Dr. Kim, you taught a course, or you didn't, but your organization taught a course at the Broward County Emergency Operations Center, that highlights these things. And so I know you're very aware of that, but I think those are the type of things that were very important that the community get together. And so yes, you've got to do all of these things, but I think that some of the foundations lie in the plan consistency and common knowledge of ICS structure, for the people that want to participate in emergency management issues, in disaster recovery issues, in disaster response issues.
So I'd just like to ask each of the panelists if they could just say a few last words, and then we'll wrap it up and we'll head on over. So Patxi, would you like to start?
Yeah, so to me, to frame it one more time, it's all about being hopeful. We have to go left or right. So just to raise the seawalls here, I've got estimates of $6 billion, 2 feet. And if you listen to the projections of where that might actually be, but just if you look at the magnitude of this, everything is doable. And I think when you look at something like, back to what Kennedy said, when it's not ask your country what it can do for you, it's what you can do for your country. This is about all of us taking responsibility. And poor FEMA, we all yell at the government and we want it to take care of us all the time. It's not going to happen that way, especially when they get whacked in Houston. Then we got these poor people in the Keys, and we got poor people in Puerto Rico. There's only so much the government can do, folks. So the balance is on all of us, and that's what this country was formed on. Really great stuff, taking our own control of our own destiny and really bonding together and doing extraordinary things. And this is the time in FAU with opportunities like this for all of us to get together. God bless you, because this is what we need more of. It's the dialogue and the engagement. And all of it gets communicated back, and you get that inertia rolling that it's not going to stop once we get that ball rolling. And it's rolling. So thank you guys for having me, and I'm always honored to be with my pals at FAU. Rock on, FAU. Good.
I think it's all about training and education and capacity building. There's who FEMA thinks we're training. I mean, they think we're training county government, local government, state government. But actually, we train a lot at universities, and we train a lot in the community. And one of the challenges that I've faced as a former provost is how best to integrate this type of training into academic degree and certificate programs. That's one challenge. Another challenge really involves the reality that a lot of the learning doesn't occur in the classroom. It actually occurs out in the field. And then it just doesn't stop when you graduate. In fact, there's more training and education that's occurring in jobs and in the private sector and organizations as well too. And somehow we have to create stronger connections between the different ways in which we train and educate, not just our students, but really our first responders and our emergency managers and government officials and others in the community that are engaged in building resilience. And so, again, that's the closing thought I have is let's invest more in training and education.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be here as an elected official. I have the privilege of really being at the center of seeing what the impacts on a community can be when it comes to disasters, and also being able to have a seat at the table to be able to set better government policy so that we invest our tax dollars in the smartest way possible to make sure that our communities are resilient. And so this was an enjoyable conference for me to sort of re-energize myself even in thinking ahead, okay, now that the hangover from the storm is sort of dissipating, you know what? Now's not the time to take your foot off the pedal. It's time to think on how much better we can be prepared for the next year, setting up our media plan, coming up with our initiatives to get the community excited and to understand our role into being, the organization, the municipal government that needs to be able to tie it all in, tie in the available resources toward what we know our community needs are, and to really be the glue that gets everybody ready to be resilient for the future. So I thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. Thank you to FAU, and I think we're ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, one last plug. So this weekend, for those of you who are not aware of the Riptide Festival, FAU will be there talking about resilience. We've got lots of the FAU folks. Riptide, 30,000 people on the beach, Fort Lauderdale. See you there on the road to Riptide. Thanks. Bye.